At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, Jo Neal, and Dr. Hannah Thurger. Now today we have two very special guests. And we're joined today by our two guests, and they're in Mexico, and it's 30 degrees in Mexico, unlike here in the UK. We have good weather, but, we're not quite 30 degrees ever, I think. So they both work for an organization called ICEERS, which is the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service. Natalia is a Mexican international human rights lawyer, a coordinator of the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. This is one of the programs of ICEERS in advocacy. Her work is mostly on indigenous initiatives, so we're going to learn a lot on that today, folks. Jesús is the director of their legal defense program. Now, Jesús studied for a while here in the UK, everyone. You'll be pleased to hear, in York, working on medical cannabis and harm reduction, and has done a lot of work advising the Mexican state on these issues. And actually, we wish he was here advising the UK government on these issues. So the overall aim of ICEERS is to integrate psychedelic plant medicine into society. So very warm welcome to you both. It's a real treat and privilege for us to learn all about your advocacy work and more about ICEERS. So I think we would like to start by you both telling us about, I guess, how you ended up working with ICEERS, where you sort of came from, a bit about your backgrounds, what you're doing now, and a bit about the organization, maybe the history and the aims and the structure.
What a privilege to be here. Thank you both for hosting us. So my name is Natalia, and I've been, a human rights lawyer ever since I studied law. I was only interested in the human rights perspective. And of course, as Mexican, we're very vulnerable to the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs. So this made me really study what the phenomenon was about. And of course, in my research, then I found this intersection of how plant medicines were being caught in the nets of prohibitionism. And this really triggered my inner fire because, of course, what I saw and I started to dig in was much more about a colonial thinking that was still predominant in, for example, the United Nations drug control treaties, which are, the international treaties and bodies that regulate plant medicines. Some of them, we'll talk about that later, and psychedelic substances as well, and how these treaties were actually perpetuating the colonial thinking. So that's where I did my master's degree in Paris, and I was focusing on studying human rights and drug policy. And this is where I studied more deeply this intersection with plant medicine and kind of how it was a legacy of colonialism. And that's where I found ICEERS. And, I coordinated the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, which is, legal defense program for ICEERS, not only for ayahuasca, that's only the name. And I had the privilege to coordinate the program 8 years, where we would be leaders in the strategy for legal defense, but also we would be experts in courts. So we have a lot of experience on the field as well. ICEERS is an organization that is in the front line. And now in this recent year, I transitioned into leaving the coordination of the legal defense program, and is now in hands of my friend Jesús. And now I'm much more focused on what we call the alliance of knowledge. It's kind of weaving knowledge systems into kind of bringing an ontological and epistemological shift in a global picture.
Can you just explain the relationship you're talking about, colonialism and psychedelic plant medicines? Can you explain a little bit about that for our readers?
Of course. Well, when I traced when was the first law that kind of perpetuated prohibitionism on a substance, it was back in China with the opium. But of course, in Mexico, we had in 1620, that was after the opium prohibition in China, we had this colonial law system that prohibited the peyote. As you know, peyote contains mescaline. And so this was the first laws that were prohibiting a substance. And if you look at the reasons why this was under prohibition, it was because of this facilitated colonialism, this spiritual colonialism of the Spanish people in Mexico. And so if you look at the drug control treaties, you can see that there's, at the moment, 3 plants that are considered illegal under international law, which is cannabis that has been kind of rescheduled into a milder kind of framework. But then you have opium poppy, also derived from the Chinese prohibitionism system. And then you have coca leaf. And this is the most prominent example of how colonial thinking is perpetuated through law. And so the reason why coca leaf as a substance is prohibited under international law is, of course, because a committee of European people came to Peru to make a study on the coca. And then the conclusions that brought to the inclusion of the coca leaf as a controlled substance is that it was really bringing degenerative race, and it brought a lot of the colonial thinking into the communities. And so then, since then, it has been a scheduled substance. And of course, as you know, coca leaf is a sacred substance. It's a sacred key, is a way of how indigenous knowledge is shared throughout the world. And coca leaf is a very special spiritual entity in the Amazon and the Andean region. And still, under international law, is a controlled substance. So it's a cultural practice, what is actually prohibited under law.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about the sort of early history of prohibition and where the laws came from. That's a really, really interesting history. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So, Jesus, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you came to work with ICEERS?
Of course, Joe. Yeah, well, my story's not that different from Natalia's. Being a lawyer in Mexico and just being in the grounds of what it is, the war on drugs, in the whole sense of what it implies. It's not only criminalizing cultural practices, which is, I think, underneath it all, what is happening with the war on drugs, but also just how our rights have been diminished. We can see it if we trace back to the early 2000s, how in Mexico the laws began to change drastically against anything that was related to substances. So as a young lawyer, that was something that was really of interest to me. But also, and another big part of my professional curiosity has always been with indigenous groups, indigenous peoples, and how all of this has affected their rights. There is a big, I would say, need to recuperate and to strengthen our indigenous communities locally. This is, of course, something that I'm really, passionate about, that I feel it in my bones. And I guess having the privilege of working with ICEERS, who are just a group of people who have this vision of changing the current landscape, for me, it was something amazing to land in this place, to have colleagues that are doing amazing work in different fields. And yeah, so again, for me, it was just amazing to land here, but also to have the opportunity to be of service, to provide some help where I can, and yeah, to help people that are currently trying to get in touch with plant medicine, or who are patients, or who practice as part of their spirituality, and having the privilege to service them and to help them through this really adverse system, which is the legal system. So that's a little bit of how I got here. And of course, a lot is also thanks to Natalia. She's always been kind of a guide to me. She's someone that I deeply admire for her work. So, I mean, it's been a privilege to be here.
And it is so important, Jesus, to have a good guide and a good mentor and somebody, to work with like that. And of course, in the UK, the war on people who use drugs has had absolutely devastating consequences that continue. And what we find when we talk to people who want to use psychedelics, the psilocybin mushroom grows everywhere in the UK. They're angry and they cannot understand that a plant can be criminalized. It just doesn't make any sense to most people, I think. So is most of your work in Mexico or is it completely international?
Well, we pretty much work. We've handled some legal incidents in over 46 countries now.
Wow.
We mainly have cases in Spain, Portugal, and the United States. Recently, we had a lot of cases in Mexico, but also from exporting countries to put them in a way. So we've recently had a lot of cases from Brazil, from Peru, and of course this is really worrisome, and it's part of the legal challenges that the globalization of ayahuasca is facing, and other plant medicines, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the cases that, the situations where you've been able to help and how you do that?
Yeah, so it's really been it's kind of a way to shift what is currently going on in the world. So it's quite interesting to see how we work with the legal practitioners, judges, prosecutors' office. We try to provide a lot of inputs, educational inputs. We also try to provide a lot of scientific evidence, and I think that is a big part of what ICEERS does, and that has helped us in a lot of cases. I'm sure Natalia can speak about some of the cases we've handled, because there has been really interesting cases, for instance, in France or here in Mexico as well. So I think how we've been handling this situation is with a lot of scientific evidence. And that has been the key to kind of untangle this whole legal complexity behind psychedelics, drugs, to say it in a sense, to kind of reframe what that actually means, and also how many of these substances cannot be categorized as, this kind of general meaning of drugs, right? So that has been one of the challenges, and I think we've been really successful in proving this or disproving what the legal practitioners assume or think.
So ayahuasca, what is the current legal position in different countries? For example, in the Netherlands, it's criminalizing.
Well, the answer to that question depends on who you ask that question to, because the situation is that DMT is a controlled substance under international law. Synthetic DMT is a controlled substance under international law. So all countries that are members of the United Nations Drug Conventions have scheduled DMT within their domestic systems. So whenever they find in an airport, let's say, that there's a bottle containing a mysterious substance, they make it a test, and then it brings a positive result for DMT. And so what happens next is that judges or prosecutors will start a legal or an investigation for possession of DMT or importation of a controlled substance. Some countries, like Mexico, have preventive prison. So this means the person goes to prison and then we need to go to trial, which is one of the most frustrating situations that we faced. Some other countries retire or contain the passport, and then the person can wait at home to face the charges or trial. So what is relevant into this answer is that for prosecutors or for state officials, for example, ayahuasca is illegal because it contains DMT. However, we've proved that this is not exactly the way it is, because the International Drug Conventions of the United Nations only have regulated synthetic substances. When they regulate plant materials, they do it explicitly, as they did with cannabis, with opium poppy, and with coca leaf. And so, for example, in France, which I think illustrates this problem, is that we had an incident back in 2016 where a judge confirmed that for ayahuasca to be considered illegal, ayahuasca as a brew containing both plants, Banisteriopsis capi and Psychotria viridis, needs to be stated in the law with its botanical's name. So in that case, after the person was put in freedom, and then the judicial system recognized and acknowledged that ayahuasca was not a controlled substance only because it contained DMT, the Ministry of Health proceeded to include ayahuasca, Panisteropsis capin psychotrabilis, into the sanitary code. So this is a perfect example of depending who you ask. So for many jurisdictions, let's say, it's illegal because it contains DMT, but for the French government, DMT is not enough to be considered illegal, so then they had to schedule ayahuasca. What happened later was a little bit more delicate, because of course then Italy followed the steps of France and scheduled ayahuasca in the law. So in Europe, it's been a little bit like the prohibitionist waves have been a little bit on the rise. What happened in the Netherlands is after a case that included also the Santo Daime, and I want to just, kind of bring here that we're talking about a human right, which is the right to exercise any religion or the freedom of consciousness. The Supreme Court of the Netherlands studied this situation, and the court determined and resolved that you could exercise the right to freedom without having the sacrament, let's say the daime, the ayahuasca. And so this is how they pondered between the right to health, what they considered the right to health, and what they considered the right to freedom. And in that kind of ponderation of rights, the court decided that not having the daime did not impede the exercise to right to freedom, which is, in my point of view, very inaccurate, because the daime in the ayahuasca is a pivot in the Santo Daime religion. So this is a little bit of the contradictions that we're facing. And on the contrary, ayahuasca is a cultural heritage in Peru. In Brazil, the religious use is regulated and honored and protected. And so this is the contradictions. This is why, what is the legal status of ayahuasca? It's depending who you ask. And so because let's just for this exercise, let's think it's in a gray zone. The Ayahuasca Defense Fund is on the front line, making sure that this gray zone is really on the white zone, because it's very clear in the technical part of the law that it is not a controlled substance only because it contains DMT.
And so how has the fund been trying to educate justice systems when they all have these conflicting views, contradicting views? Kind of what are the key arguments that you've used in some of the cases to really support the cultural and religious use of ayahuasca?
Well, I think this comes back to what Jesús was saying about the scientific piece. In ICEERS, it's been really also a privilege to witness how science is really being able to frame public policy. And this comes back also to one of the challenges that we face, the main challenge that we face. And I think this is transversal and not only related to harm reduction, drug policy, or psychedelic regulation. This is a transversal thing that we need to really put all of our efforts in, is that public policy is not evidence-based.
Yeah, our drug laws are not evidence-based at all, political.
And this is, I think, a greater calling. This is a meta shift also in global consciousness. And I think that the psychedelic space needs to take responsibility for this as well, and kind of influence that this is a collective calling that we all need to assume, of course, because we need to really make sure that this is the moment. And due to the political climate, we really need to make sure that no matter what happens, no matter who's in government, all laws, all public policy needs to be based on science. And on science, I also want to bring some of the kind of ICEERS work here, is not only the biomedical science or the biomedical perspective. This is where we need to really emphasize the vital importance of bringing, indigenous knowledge systems and decolonial perspectives into the conversation around drug policy, in particular, and plant medicine regulation and other fields of life. But I think this is what, from not only the ADF or ICEERS, but I think this is as a collective. If we're talking about psychedelics, about drugs, about whatever, this is a greater calling that we all need to take our piece of the cake.
This is a pivotal moment, I think, with the psychedelic renaissance. And do you have a sense of that things are changing?
Well, I believe that we are also running kind of in circles and not in the best way. And in a sense that there's also the risk of commodifying many of these substances and many of the plants. And it's important to acknowledge that these plants are not just plants or substances. These are beings that have a spiritual value for a lot of indigenous communities. these are sacred plants. These are entities that are pretty much the essence of a lot of the way that people stand in Earth. And I think one of the risks that we're seeing with the psychedelic renaissance is just the extraction and also the commodification. I am not an advocate of extracting and just giving the substance without any sort of ceremonial practice behind it. I think it's part of the essence of understanding, of acknowledging it, of internalizing it, and also of healing. I know that a lot of people from Western culture, as myself, we seek into these cultures and in these plants healing for many of the things that are going on in the world, right? Not only personal issues, but also, an economic system that is really adverse, global depression, war, and all of these things that are currently happening. And I know, and I'm sure that all these practices are a key or are a tool, an essential tool into healing us, to reconnecting us with Earth, with our real essence. But then we have to mediate between providing this healing and also assuring that indigenous communities are not going to be extracted of this and are not going to be without any sort of reciprocity as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the main issues that we currently are seeing in the psychedelic renaissance, and that it's really worse.
Yeah, and that's a conversation that hopefully is being picked up more in terms of reciprocity and benefit sharing, but also the absolute importance of making sure that indigenous knowledge and different worldviews are respected and upheld, and there's a place at the table always. And just more, I would love to hear more about the work that ICEERS does with that, to try and promote that within very Western frameworks of ensuring that indigenous knowledge is brought to the forefront.
Yes, and actually I see it as a kind of a bridge weaver that I've been kind of in my first kind of mission being in front of the ADF during 8 years, just making sure that no one was being put in prison for the use or importation of plant medicines. And now that I'm shifting much more into this alliance of knowledge, and of course, as a lawyer, I'm still putting my time and my energy into providing legal support to indigenous peoples. And this has been, in my view, one of the main shifts that have really honored this. I would call it, it's a law. It's also a law. It's kind of a spiritual law of bringing back to nature and to really supporting indigenous peoples, what they're facing. And for example, right now we're helping out a community that has been displaced for the armed conflict in Colombia. And so we're helping them get that status. We're helping another, the leader of the Shipibo organization, to kind of protect his land. And so kind of ICEERS really is shifting into more the land and what does that mean. And it's also when they talk about, and I really, I'm very grateful when I hear that in the psychedelic space, they're talking about reciprocity and they're talking about benefit sharing. But for me, there's something about these words that are kind of empty as well. Because I think what we need to reweave and is an understanding that this is about the earth. This is not about the psychedelic renaissance, whatever that means. I'm very skeptic about this so-called psychedelic renaissance. For me, this is about the land. This is about nature. And so for me, this is also a paradox that we see all these plant medicines around the world, and ayahuasca, we've had incidents in Australia, New Zealand, in Asia. It's just fascinating to see how these entities have traveled so far. But yet in the Amazon, you have atrocities that are being conducted still. And so there's kind of, for me, there's something about integrity that we cannot celebrate a psychedelic renaissance until we're not sure that the house of these entities and substances are safe and sound for extractivism. And this is a pivot change as well, but I'm just not seeing this discourse emerge in the psychedelic space. And this is something that I'm very worried about. And so I think ICEERS is also making sure that we keep our feet on the ground, helping the indigenous with the very basic things before we talk about patents, clinical trials, the commodification. that's not where I think this should be going. This is about coming back to actually basic, land and water, and just having the indigenous peoples, supporting them so that they continue to preserve life.
Well, yes, because we won't have any plant medicines if we don't look after indigenous people and practices. We watched with horror the Amazon being destroyed daily. And so many medicines, I think it was Dennis McKenna said, that we actually haven't discovered yet. And we're losing that. So this is also quite a large part of your work now, is it?
Yes. So we're now more dedicated into that piece, because of course, or even if we preserve plant medicines and we don't preserve the indigenous peoples, we will continue to be a society that is kind of an orphan.
Yeah, we won't know how to use them.
If we lose the cultural practices, then there's no plant medicines.
And how have you built those relationships with the different indigenous peoples that you've been working with? Has that been built over time? Have they come to you for the legal support? How do you get the word out there that you're there to provide support when legal support is needed?
Well, I think this has been a very long process. ICEERS has been kind of in service during 15 years already. And so with the communities, it's all about building trust. It's also, I think, one of the main views or worldviews of ICEERS is not really being of just assistance, like a Western NGO that is in assistance and we're going to save anyone. We don't work that way. We don't think that way. It's all about we are both strengthening each other. We're both learning. And so, of course, they're elders, and we have the privilege to be in contact with wisdom keepers. And so one of the things that we're also seeing that is very important is when we consult with them the problems of our society, and they're able to give us feedback on how to act on the other field. Because of course we're kind of a bridge between the indigenous world and the Western world. And so it's fascinating to see how this flow of knowledge is also running both ways, right? So when we tell them what we're seeing with the globalization of plant medicines, that we're worried about the incidents that we're seeing, because of course the IDF is also kind of an information hub of what is going on with plant medicines. And sometimes we see things that are really challenging. And so we go back with the indigenous and we consult with them what is going on. We consult with them what's going on with the coca leaf procedure that they want to, bring a dialogue for the eventual reclassification of coca leaf in the drug control treaties. And they're fascinated about this because they have very sophisticated knowledge systems. They really understand the law because they manage spiritual laws. So they're lawyers. So they really have a lot of inputs. They really have a lot to share. And so it's about building trust, but it's also about kind of strengthening each other so that we can be, in the front lines doing our work in alliance.
Yeah, that's a fantastic perspective, actually, that you can only do this together. So just to go back then to the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, if somebody finds themselves in a legal incident, what kind of are the first steps? Will they know to contact you, or do you find them?
So what usually happens is we get information about a legal incident, either by the person themselves or by close friends or allies. And then what we try to provide is first legal assistance in the sense that if they already have a lawyer, if they don't, we're trying to build a network of lawyers who are specialized in this field. We try to give these lawyers just general and basic information about what it is that they're dealing with, because the first and most common misconception is that this is a drug case, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. I think the first challenge is always getting the lawyers to kind of shift their mentality into this is not a drug case, this is something else.
And how difficult is that?
It's quite difficult. It really, and this is something that we see globally. It's not just something, from a lawyer from this and that country. It's just in general, lawyers tend to have this kind of like thinking of that we know everything, and that, so that's the first challenge. So we're trying to build this network. We're trying to provide, of course, education inputs to them, giving them the information really digested, So I think one of the main documents that we share, and I think it's fascinating how well it has worked, is the technical report on ayahuasca. This is something that was built by a lot of the scientific community, led by Dr. Jose Carlos Bozo, who is the lead scientist at ICEERS, and also Constanza Sanchez, who is the head of legal, human rights, and policy. And this is really a great input to provide, because it gives you all the information, historical information, anthropological information about ayahuasca, but also scientific information about ayahuasca. And yeah, this document is, I think it's crucial for authorities to understand. It's really simple. It's written in a really simple way, so pretty much anyone can understand what it is. So I think that's the first challenge. And then it really depends on the country, because there are countries that have a really strong stand against drugs in general. So what Natalia was saying earlier, that for instance in Mexico, we have the preventive prison. Anything related to drugs automatically is put in prison. We see that also in some countries in Asia, even some countries in Europe, especially when they're dealing with foreign people. Usually when an indigenous comes with their ayahuasca in their luggage, they get apprehended. And since they're foreigners, what usually judges decide is to put them in preventive prison. So that is the second biggest challenge, trying to address all of this policy changes regarding drug laws. Yeah, so that's pretty much the beginning of how it starts. And then we, depending on the case, depending on the country, how the incident happened, then we try to tackle those issues and provide the lawyers with all the information that might be needed.
And are you surprised, I suppose you're not, at the lack of knowledge that a lot of the legal profession have about this?
Well, it really is not surprising, because it's quite a niche topic. We don't get this sort of information in law school. We usually don't get the opportunity to criticize the legislation. We just try to apply it and just go through it, and try to find the legal loopholes. So it's kind of a different way to understand how law works, how law is created, and how to address these issues. So I think that's the first main issue, is we don't get to experience this in law school.
So we need to educate really from the grassroots when people are starting to go to law school.
Yeah, and it's the same in the UK. I mean, you have people coming out from different degrees, whether it be law or medicine, just with a lack of education in drugs. And it needs to be just integrated better from the get-go. Do you know if there's kind of any improvements in education within law in relation to drug policy? Are things changing?
I think things are starting to change in regard to drug policy. I think that when Jesús and I went to law school, we really never heard about the kind of someone challenging the war on drugs. However, through, countries like Colombia or Mexico that have been even bringing militarization of the discourse of this creation of the war on drugs, we really have been kind of educating ourselves about this. But of course, a lot of people are in favor of militarization. A lot of people are in favor of kind of bringing this aggressive and violent strategy to eradicate, what has been, kind of created since the 60s in the United States. And they have kind of really financed in the region a lot of this war. And so this is kind of, what I feel is in the Latin American region, this is unsustainable, and so new ontologies, a new kind of understanding have emerged. And now, of course, there's a lot of universities doing a lot of research on this paradigm. And this is, again, this is not evidence-based. This is a war that is not evidence-based. It's not bringing the results. Fentanyl is the son of prohibitionism.
Yeah, all of them. Yeah.
So this is a spiral that is never ending. So I don't know what needs to happen so that this can actually change. And of course, this year in the CND, which is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in the United Nations in Vienna, we saw for the first time a resolution that was kind of impulsed by the government of Colombia, just asking all the countries to have a panel of experts review all the drug control regime. And this was passed, for once in history.
Wow, that's an enormous achievement.
It's an enormous change. It's kind of a little bit of a light in the tunnel after so many years of prohibitionism and, this discourse being, seeing a discourse prosper when it's not evidence-based, it's not human rights-based, it's not based on anything except stigma, discrimination, colonialism, and just prohibitionism as the only strategy that has been implemented since the opium crisis in China.
It's unbelievable. And so many people have died. And it's the escalation of the violence and death is absolutely heartbreaking and extraordinary. And that governments cannot see that or won't see it. It's unbelievable to me.
And so what could be the potential implications then with Colombia? So I have, through our friends at Release and Transform, more Transform, I remember hearing some waves of potential regulation of cocaine. So there's kind of movement there. Do you know much more about progress in relation to that at all?
Well, I'm a bit skeptic that it will go that far into kind of really bringing regulation systems for substances. I think we're really teenagers here in regards to drug policy, and I think just decriminalization is the word that for me would be enough. Just that, and just having a panel of experts for once in history, because normally who drafted these conventions? Yeah. Diplomats. They're not experts in anything, with all respect. It's just in diplomacy, you know what I mean? But that's not science. That's nothing in regards to what is needed. So just having a panel of experts for the first time in history of drug control regime is just huge. So let's see what the conclusions come to, and let's see what the United Nations will be willing to adapt. But of course, we have pressures of other countries. For example, Russia voted against this resolution. USA voted against this resolution. And Argentina voted against this resolution. And so there's some states that are not willing to have this evidence-based and rights-based approaches. A lot of Asian countries, China, United States, Russia, they're not really willing to have this approach to science and really kind of opening this regime and just recognizing and acknowledging that prohibitionism and criminalization actually leads nowhere. And this is a public health crisis, especially with the fentanyl. Like, this is a very serious call to action.
Absolutely. And we are not doing well in the UK at listening to experts at all. Of course, as David Nutt will tell you, it's absolutely dreadful. But this does sound like a very hopeful development. And do you think, well, something good about this psychedelic renaissance maybe that will, people will really understand the benefits and the importance of plant medicines, and that sort of in a way could change things. And it's certainly, I guess, part of your work.
Yes, and we're seeing a lot of countries and states in the US, for instance, changing their legislation towards a little bit more open to psychedelics, to plant medicine practices. And this, of course, is something positive, I think, in general terms, but unfortunately, I think when you look at it in the microscope, there are things that are still not necessarily in the best way. And we see it a lot with cannabis. I think cannabis is a great example of how policy and legislation might not bring the best outcomes, right? So we're seeing also some challenges in that matter. And I think for psychedelics, it's the risk is a little bit higher because there's a lot of cultures that are dependent on these plants. And this, of course, is going to bring an additional stress to those communities and those cultures. So I think it's positive that we're seeing a change, but also, for instance, this whole scenario with the Veterans Office in the US and giving a lot of money to research psychedelics for treating veterans, right? Of course, this is something that it's really powerful and it's really promising. But I think that the question is, why are we still sending people to war, right? I mean, we need to address those real issues. Yes, these are powerful tools. These are amazing medicines that can help people overcome these horrible things that have happened to them. But the bigger question is, why are we still sending people to war and just expecting them to come back, give them something, and send them right back? So there are these issues that are ongoing right now, and I think that's a serious discussion that we need to have in this field. Is this something that we really aspire to? Is this what we really want? And is this the best way to address it?
You're right. There's a much, much broader, deeper conversation to be had. You're absolutely right. Than sending people to war and then, bringing them back and giving them a medicine and then sending them back. Yeah, it's absolutely appalling. Can you tell us, have you been involved in any cases that we might have heard of? Any high profile cases?
Well, in the ADF, we've had a lot of high profile situations. I really don't even know what to share because we have a lot of things that we supported in the last years.
Well, a lot of big wins. Have you had some big wins, that you really felt, right, well, that shows that we can really change things?
Well, Jesús, do you want to share some of our big wins?
Well, it's difficult because also just the whole judicial process, it's so long and it's so, it can really, break you because you're thinking of a 3 to 4 year span to something be resolved by the judiciary. So a lot can happen in that time. And also these are people, these are stories, these are children who are leaving their families, these are parents who are leaving their children back at their communities. These are communities without their doctors, without their leaders. So there has been a lot of cases. There has been a lot of high-profile cases. I think we've managed to get landmark decisions in many of these cases, particularly in Spain. We've seen great outcomes. In France, this was an amazing outcome, although it was kind of rolled back with the legislation. There, I think Natalia can explain a little bit more about the Santo Daime case, because I think it's a really big case that the ADF has been working on for a lot of years now. And also here in Mexico, we've had some really interesting cases, especially regarding the protection of indigenous rights. So Mexico is kind of a particular setting. We're kind of like the border between full Western culture and also Latin America with this cultural heritage. And we've seen a lot of backs and forths on this. So I think we've managed to get some really nice outcomes regarding the protection and the recognition of indigenous human rights. But yeah, I mean, in the US also, there's been a lot of interesting cases that I think are really important of how the whole international framework is actually moving. But yeah, we've had some interesting outcomes.
What have been some of those? Have there been direct policy changes then in Mexico? Any that you've been involved in that's been really protecting indigenous rights?
Well, we've secured some procedural indigenous rights. So I think that has been one of the biggest outcomes. Just the respect of having people being judged in their language, although it's something that's already a constitutional right.
Yeah.
Yeah, although it is a constitutional right that's been recognized for more than 30 years now, in the practice, this is not happening. So that has been one of the, it sounds kind of, simple, but it's been such a big challenge to get the judiciary to understand that, people need to be judged in their own language so they can understand what is happening.
And especially, I think the hardest part here within the translation is the cultural translation, because we've seen with the indigenous peoples that we've defended that we kind of obtained freedom. Many of them spent around 1.5 years in prison. 3 of them spent 1.5 years in prison in Mexico, some of them in Spain, some of them in the US.
Portugal as well.
Portugal. So I guess also as, human rights lawyers, we're also kind of cultural translators, because it's really heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to explain to an indigenous person that this person is being persecuted for the use of, just imagine, something that it's not only a substance, it's their dances, it's their cultural way of survival, it's a community unification, it's it's more than just a substance. And so this is really heartbreaking to also be the cultural translators of a legal process. And I think this is something that the courts have not really understand. They don't really understand what this means for an indigenous person. And of course, if this is a spiritual leader, just imagine that you're an indigenous leader is being deprived from liberty, then of course the community is suffering as a whole. And so this is kind of the more subtle things that we see that are not obvious at all.
Not obvious, and they're not recognised either. And if people aren't open to being able to understand that and being able to see that bigger picture, just seeing the absolute harm that's being done.
Of course. And then we also had, this is also heartbreaking, but we also had this British citizen that is facing, is it 5 years of prison in Bali for the use of coca leaf. So this is also heartbreaking. Or we have a Spanish citizen in China that is facing life sentence for the importation of ayahuasca in San Pedro, Huachuma. And another, Russian Peruvian citizen that received a package with ayahuasca and coca leaf in Russia is also, he faced 8 years of prison, and this year he's kind of done with that spiritual ritual.
Isn't that absolutely terrifying?
Honestly, the work of the IDF is very important, not only because the first goal is to obtain freedom, immediate freedom, but also we like to see each legal challenge as an opportunity to shift things. So it's kind of, we see it like someone makes an offering and then we just intercede and we're able to kind of at least shift and play. And we've also had very emotional moments in courts where judges really understand what this is about. They really get that this is about colonialism. They're also they feel offended that prosecutors are actually doing this. And so we've seen a lot of things, right? And we've also seen the prosecutors or the judges that say this is illegal and this is an hallucinogen, whatever that word means. It's not evidence-based, it's not science-based, but I don't know why they believe that having hallucinations is prohibited under, I don't know which law. And so we've seen a lot of things happen. So it's really important. It's really important work because it really shifts kind of in the small scale, but then that really resonates in the larger picture a lot.
Yeah, that's what you have to hope. It's baby steps, which will then expand further and further. So through your work, is there any countries that you feel like could be leading the way that maybe are more progressive?
That's such a difficult question because also the political climate is, I see a shift, right? I see kind of reframing of what we understand are human rights in a more restrictive way. We see governments that are pushing back on many of the things that we've accomplished as society, right? We see it in the Americas, we see it in Europe, of course, we see it in Asia and Africa and elsewhere. So it's difficult to answer this question of who is advancing more. I think there's a lot of local efforts that are really worth recognizing. Colorado, Oregon, even Australia with the whole psilocybin. There are some efforts in Latin America as well to recognize these plants as part of their cultural heritage as being protected. We are seeing efforts in Bolivia, in Chile, some efforts in Mexico as well. But I guess the biggest problem is that there's this huge weight, this huge inertia of the war on drugs. I mean, it fails to distinguish between something that can be, something that can alleviate pain, something that can provide a cultural or spiritual connection between criminals. And I think this is difficult. We have to change the whole rhetoric around these substances.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess something drug science are trying to do is education all the way. I guess when I talk about the disaster and the harm of the war on people who use drugs, I give Portugal as an example because they had the sense to decriminalize all drugs in the 90s. And is that a good country for plant medicine?
No, Portugal is like a magician. Like, he makes us believe that they're actually, breaking the paradigm of the war on drugs. But this is an illusion. This whole decriminalization of all drugs is really an illusion, in the sense that also they have a lot of administrative law also kind of compensating over there. But in the last, I would say, maybe 2 years, we've seen a rise on legal incidents because, of course, a lot of people move to Portugal so they can actually be left alone. And then there's a lot of airplanes coming from the Amazon, like Brazil, Portugal, like there's a direct flight, and you need to just be in another place in Europe. And of course, they're being detained all of a sudden. And also an indigenous person was recently detained. And so I don't know, Jesus, if you want to kind of share more about this, but this is an illusion for sure.
Yes, they have a really restrictive laws. So yeah, there's this sense of, or this imaginary sense that Portugal is a safe place to practice plant medicine, and on the contrary, it's quite harsh. We see a judiciary that is really conservative in the way they interpret the law, in the way they address these issues. So yeah, I would say for this, but I think on the other side, Spain would be, I mean, and I want to be really cautious with my wording, but Spain would be a more open space for plant medicine, because the judiciary has been really incisive with the distinction between DMT as a synthetic substance and ayahuasca that may contain DMT, or other substances that may contain DMT. So I think that gives us at least a base scenario where we can start building and constructing a new way to understand how these plants work, their potential, their therapeutic value, their cultural value. I think this is the best case scenario to start, right? Not as something prohibited, but as something in the gray area where we can kind of discuss how we should address this.
Mm-hmm. And personal use in Spain is decriminalized as well. So this also helps a lot. So yeah, Spain for sure, I think, is, at least in Europe, should be, because I don't know it's acknowledged as such, but I think it should be a leader for sure.
Sounds like
they did a lot of drug policy and harm reduction as well.
Yeah, I've been impressed by harm reduction in some of the European countries, which the UK is not doing well at all. And I guess, Hannah, that brings us on to the trial in Catalonia.
Yeah, just to lightly touch on it, because I just think the listeners would be really interested to hear about the Ibogaine clinical trial for opioid dependence, a heavily under-researched area, and need only increasing, massive consequence of the war on drugs, as we've discussed already. Just a little bit about how that trial came about and why you chose to do it in Spain.
For sure. Well, of course, in Spain, I mean, first of all, it's where ICEERS is based. And a lot of or mainly the scientific team at ICEERS is in Spain, and they're very well-known scientists, pharmacologists, psychologists, especially Dr. José Carlos Bozo. He has been a leader in the research of plant medicines, and also MDMA. He was kind of the pioneers of this research. And so he really framed, clinical trial in Catalonia around Ibogaine. As you said, it's not really serious research is really needed, especially in different countries and different languages. Of course, we need really to shift how science is also being done. And of course, Spain has a best climate for this scientific research being conducted. And what was also really a gift was to have this research being done in a well-known hospital with really professional and very professionalized people around mental health and the use of these substances. What was a challenge, of course, as usual, with at least some of the controlled substances, because as we know, this substance is not controlled just in some countries, Portugal, UK, United States, and Canada. Other than those countries, Ibogaine is not a controlled substance. But still, it's hard to get funding for these clinical trials. And then, of course, the results of this clinical trial was outrageous, in the sense that it's really a component that could bring a solution for the health crisis that we're facing. And of course, what is different from other substances is that with Ibogaine, you really need to have a very controlled climate, and you really need to have health professionals on board. And so just having this very specialized, highly specialized people conducting this clinical trial, I think, was well seen also in Spain and in Europe. And of course, in Spain, there's no I was reading a report that fentanyl is not an issue in Spain as opposed to other countries. But of course, this also, adds to the scientific research being done. And so, yeah, especially with the clinical trials being the only way to prove that this is safe. There's no other way. There's no other way. We can go to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. We're all kind of, waiting for the FDA to give us permission to do something. And it's kind of really against a colonial,
approach.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Controls what is science, what is evidence, what is safe, what is breakthrough therapy, what is not, what can be a patent, what cannot be. And of course, for that clinical trials to proceed and prosper, you need a lot of finance. So of course, then you're incentivizing the commodification, the capitalist approach. And so you're kind of in a loop here.
Yeah, no, I mean, funding for trials in the UK, we have the same issues, but it's such an exciting trial to see out there. Yeah, I was really, really excited to read about it and would really recommend that people go and read more on the ICEERS website, just to hear more about that protocol that you were talking about, the very specific study design for people who want to find out more. Yeah, really, really clever and exciting results, like you were saying. But again, of course, having to follow that strict the strict structure of research in the Western world. And, one thing drug science does push for is the recognition of real world evidence and other evidence sources as well. So just trying to increase that conversation around different types of evidence and how they might be recognized.
And using the indigenous wisdom and knowledge about the safety and the right way to use the medicines in ceremony. And, it is worrying. Are we listening to that? Are we learning from that? I think that is a worry that maybe we're not listening. So this has been such a great conversation. Our listeners are going to absolutely love this. It's a really, really important perspective. And the advocacy work you're doing is absolutely amazing. It's wonderful. Such a lot of work. Are there any sort of take-home messages you have for our listeners? Difficult one, I think. Listening to the whole thing.
I guess first to follow ICEERS. I guess that would be like the first take-home message. To follow our work. I think we're trying to hold the space while we're having these conversations out there. Either legality, evidence-based approaches, integration of these practices. Also, that's something that we're really working on, kind of building from bottom up, having local efforts of how to self-regulate, what are the best practices, having safety and security measures for people who do plant medicine. And I think that would be the first thing, to follow ICEERS.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's coming back to, this ontological shift is not only, this is a shared responsibility. Of course, some of us are in service and we've been doing a lot of work, but I think we're reaching a point where if you're in the psychedelic space, if you're in the harm reduction movement, you're in the drug policy movement, I think this is something that we really need to put our hands together and just push forward a new agenda and really just bring to life new ways of being here. Because of course, and as I said, for me, it's all about how can we make sure that public policy is evidence-based. And by evidence, again, just bringing the decolonial thinking as evidence as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic, actually, both of you, absolutely fantastic messages and learnings for us and for our listeners.
Absolutely perfect way to finish with drug science motto of evidence-based drug policy. But I think, again, just reiterating, taking in those different worldviews is something that we kind of need to remember from our Western perspective of scientists as well, and having that built into our education systems as well here.
And also maybe just share that if any legal incident or any consultation or any whatever, there's a magical wand called law, LAW, at ICEERS.org. That's where we get contacted whenever there's a legal incident, someone is detained, airports, whatever. You just send an email and we make sure that we support accordingly.
Amazing. I'm sure we can put that in the show
Oh,
notes.
yeah, people absolutely need to be aware of that.
Put it at the end so that they have to listen to all of
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. So they've learned an awful lot along the way. That's great. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hannah. Thank you, Joe.
That's brilliant. Really so great.